Alright, y'all, this is Jamie with Country Diggers. Today we're going to do another installment of Princesses Behaving Badly by Linda Rodriguez McRobbie. I'm going to be doing a lot more of these this winter because of the weather probably. But today we're going to go into Caroline of Brunswick-Wolfenbuttel. Okay, the princess who didn't wash. So stay tuned for that. Caroline of Brunswick-Wolfenbuttel, the princess who didn't wash. May 17th, 1768 to August 7th, 1821. Britain and various continental tourist spots. George, Prince of Wales, met his intended bride, Princess Caroline of Brunswick-Wolfenbuttel, for the first time 2 days before their marriage. Etiquette demanded that he embrace her, which he did, then recoiled and fled the room, crying to his servant, "I am not well. Pray get me a glass of brandy." He stayed drunk for the next 3 days. The relationship went downhill from there. Nobody knows what it was about Caroline that turned off the prince so violently at that introduction. She wasn't storybook beautiful, but she certainly wasn't run away and get drunk ugly. And though she was known for being less than dedicated to her personal hygiene, contemporary accounts claim that she had been groomed particularly well for the meeting. Nevertheless, the two had barely exchanged conversation before George decided she was his intellectual and social inferior, a woman to be endured, not enjoyed. And the prince's good opinion, once lost, was lost forever. Not that he was any catch either. Prinny, as the 32-year-old prince was widely and absurdly known, was vain and snobbish, but could be extremely charming when he wanted to be. He was also a corset-wearing drunk. A corset-wearing drunk. A man wearing a corset. Who would later tip the scales at almost 240 pounds. A terrible gambler and talented spender. He was always in debt. And then there was the little detail that he was already married, and had been for 10 years, to the very patient Maria Fitzenbert. None of that mattered a bit in the royal marriage market. Mrs. Fitzherbert was a commoner, and even worse for the Protestant crown, a Catholic. The pair had wed without the king's consent. So technically, the marriage didn't count. And what did a few extra pounds and an awful personality matter next to the fact that he'd be king? By royal logic, the prince was the most eligible bachelor in Europe. Prinny needed to get hitched, and fast. By 1794, he was an incredible £650,000 in debt. More than $40 million today. Wow. Having spent wildly on art, building projects, fancy clothing, wine, and racehorses. Crisis hit when several angry tradesmen to whom he owed money filed a petition demanding payment. Parliament would agree to pay the debts only if the prince married. No one, least of all Prinny, cared who the bride was, and as long as she was a princess, a Protestant, and in possession of a pulse. Princess Caroline, the extremely available daughter of a powerful German duke, was the prince's first cousin. It's likely that hers was the first name mentioned, and that Prinny, anxious to get out from under his weighty debt, seized on it. Had he done even the slightest bit of homework on his would-be wife, perhaps the whole farcical tragedy that followed would have been avoided, because unfortunately his 26-year-old cousin was the rotund embodiment of everything he loathed. Though good-natured, Caroline was untidy, graceless, and chubby. She was also loud, vulgar, and devoid of tact or discretion. She liked to flirt, earning her a reputation as very loose and guilty of indecent conduct. She wasn't stupid exactly, but she was shallow. She loved gossip, asked impertinent questions, had a rude sense of humor, and was often childish and disrespectful. Adding to this pretty picture, Caroline didn't wash, or at least not enough. Her undergarments, too, went overly long between launderings. Were there ever two people more ill-suited for each other? Things only got worse after their first meeting. Once the prince beat his hasty retreat, Caroline declared that he was fatter than in his portrait. At dinner that night, she was her worst possible self, trying to be clever but coming off as unhinged, as was Prinny, cold, rude, and drunk. But the show had to go on, and the couple was married 2 days later on April 8th, 1795. According to contemporary reports, the bridegroom looked like death and was obviously wasted. Weepy and loud, he had to be held up by his groomsmen. According to Caroline, he spent their wedding night passed out in the fireplace. They went on their honeymoon with all of his constantly drunk and dirty mates, plus his mistress to boot. Oh my. Surprisingly, the pair did manage to get on well enough for Caroline to become pregnant, almost immediately, though the birth of their daughter Charlotte on January 7, 1796, did little to foster a rapprochement. 3 days after she was born, George made out a new will, leaving everything to his wife, the dear Mrs. Fitzherbert, and 1 shilling to Caroline. By June 1796, Prinny's hatred of Caroline was intractable. My abhorrence of her is such that I shudder at the very thoughts of sitting at the same table as her, or even being under the same roof, he wrote. The feeling was mutual. Just a year later, they officially separated. But what God and country had joined, no man could put asunder. Neither the king nor Parliament would grant permission to divorce. Protestants ironically see Anne Boleyn Anne Boleyn took divorce very seriously, and the marriage was important diplomatically. They were stuck with each other. Okay, it says, see Anne Boleyn as an example. Okay. Of the two of them, Prinny was undoubtedly better off. As a male royal, it was expected that he would have mistresses. But for Caroline, adultery would mean a wealth stripping split. That left her in a delicate position, which was particularly difficult for a woman with no sense of delicacy whatsoever. European courts practically ran on rumor, and Caroline's behavior did little to stop the chatter. She was a big fan of plunging neckline, as in nipples out, and appeared to apply her makeup with a trowel. Okay. She could be a charming hostess, but was also an incorrigible flirt who sometimes disappeared for hours with a gentleman friend, leaving her other guests to try to politely ignore her absence. Even worse, Caroline allegedly boasted that she took a bedfellow whenever she wanted, and the prince paid for it all. Sprinkled liberally with this kind of manure, rumors quickly sprouted that the princess was conducting several affairs. For a while, it was just talk, but then Caroline gave the prince almost the scandal he needed to divorce her. Caroline had a weird habit of collecting babies. To her credit, she seemed chiefly concerned with finding good homes for the foundlings. But in 1802, she adopted a baby boy named William Austin, known thereafter as Willikin, bizarrely pretended that he was her own. Why she thought it would be funny to say so is unclear, but it's likely she just wanted to cause a fuss. Her allies, including her father-in-law, King George III, dismissed the stories of a bastard child as idle talk, and her foes could prove nothing because there was nothing to prove. By 1806, Caroline had committed a critical error. She made enemies of the Douglases, her former friends and neighbors. It was to Lady Douglas that Caroline first pretended that Wilkin was her child. After a few months of close friendship, however, Caroline grew bored with the couple and was rude when Lady Douglas came to call. When Lady Douglas wrote to Caroline, implying that she had secrets about the princess she was willing to spill, Caroline reacted in a spectacularly ill-considered fashion. She sent her former friend obscene and harassing anonymous letters featuring poor drawn pictures of Lady D performing a sex act. Oh dear. The Douglases were quite sure the letters were from Caroline. At least one bore her royal seal. The offended Douglases, who it should be noted were also perpetually broke, marched straight to the prince and made it clear they would swear that Wilkin was Caroline's bastard child. For good measure, Lady Douglas even accused the princess of trying to touch and kiss her inappropriately. Oh my. Armed with such evidence, the prince demanded an investigation into his estranged wife's supposed infidelity. The ensuing delicate investigation, as it was called, was conducted by a secret government committee. This is almost like King Henry VIII's matter. his matter, okay? But secret investigative committee. Witnesses included everyone from Caroline's footman to her portrait painter, Thomas Lawrence. Ultimately, Wilkins' real mother testified that she's indeed given him up to the princess when he was 4 months old, and the commission had no choice but to clear Caroline of all accusations. Prenny wouldn't get his divorce so easily. Caroline had also won another decision, this one in the court of public opinion. Because the investigation was meant to be secret, it was, of course, common knowledge among the gossips at court. Details filtered down through the newspapers in a series of leaked documents. Caroline won the sympathy of the British public by portraying herself as a maligned wife and mother who was denied access to her child. But most of her support came because everyone hated Prenny. The British people and press had no use for fools, especially fat, drunken ones who wasted taxpayer money on mistresses and wine. Novelist Jane Austen, writing in 1813 about Caroline, summed it up best. Poor woman, I shall support her as long as I can because she is a woman and because I hate her husband. Okay. However, much of the public loved Caroline. Her aristocratic peers did not. Her social isolation was nearly complete after George III was declared insane in 1811. The prince officially then became regent, which meant that friendship with Caroline was a political liability for anyone who wanted to be received at court. Moreover, she had committed the one sin that fashionable English society could not forgive. She had become a bore. Caroline's exasperated ladies-in-waiting were fed up hearing about how she had been monstrously treated by the royal family, how she hated them, and the various creative ways she'd like to see them die. Sometimes after dinner, Caroline spent the evening sticking pins into a wax doll made to look like the prince before melting it over the fire. This same behavior would have gotten her beheaded had she lived in Anne Boleyn's day. Oh, yes. In August 1814, Caroline left England, spending the next 6 years traveling. In Geneva that October, the now blowsy woman of 46 embarrassed herself and everyone around her by attending a ball in her honor. Dressed in Venus, or rather not dressed further than the waist. Oh my goodness. The next year, an English aristocrat who met Caroline in Geneva described her as a fat woman of 50 years of age, short, plump, and high-colored, wearing a pink bodice, cut very low, and a short white skirt which hardly came below her knees. Another recalled her black wig and girl's white frock, cut disgustingly low to her stomach. Caroline bounced around Europe and the Mediterranean, sometimes received by aristocratic houses, but more often snubbed, especially as stories of her strange behavior spread. Having lost the last of her respectable entourage by the end of 1815, she was attended by a ragtag group of hangers-on and adventurers, inerrant show players and musicians, and scandalous persons of low birth. She engaged in affairs widely and publicly, canoodling with everyone from the King of Naples, brother-in-law of Napoleon, and therefore an enemy to England, to her Italian valet, or so the gossips said. So complete was her break with the court that no official word was sent of her daughter Charlotte's marriage on May 2nd, 1816. When Charlotte died in childbirth on November 6, 1817, Caroline, then living in an Italian villa on Lake Como, found out by reading about the tragedy in a newspaper. In January 1820, poor Mad George III died, and Prinny became His Majesty King George IV. But he flat out refused to allow Caroline to be queen. In June of that year, his ministers offered her an astounding £50,000 a year, about $6 million, to renounce her title and never return. Instead, she came bustling back to England, aglow with righteous indignation and bleating about her rights. Okay. Caroline did have supporters back home. Despite her long absences, the British public loved her even more when they saw her thumbing her nose at the much-hated royal family. Her return was attended by pro-Queen Caroline rallies, most of which turned into window-breaking riots. While mobs stood under the king's window and called him Nero, even the military seemed on the verge of mutiny. Meanwhile, the country's two main political parties girded their loins. Caroline's side was taken up by the opposition party, the Whigs. They were opposed to the Troys, who were the king's favorites and the party in power. The king declared he had rather abdicate than recognize Caroline as queen, with rebellion staring them in the face. The British government was forced to act. In August 1820, the Pains and Penalties Bill was brought before Parliament, an effort to legally dissolve Caroline and George's marriage by declaring her guilty of adultery. But if the government was trying to avoid a scandal, they failed spectacularly. Let's see. The resulting trial aired all sorts of shocking and ridiculous details. First to take the stand was an Italian servant of Caroline's who testified that her supposed lover, the Italian valet Bergami, did not often sleep in his own bed. Further, he claimed he once heard sounds like the cracking of a bench coming from a tent in which Bergami and Caroline were together. Other witnesses claimed that the chamber pots in Caroline's rooms contained a good deal more than a single person could produce. And still another claimed that he had come upon Bergami and Caroline asleep in a carriage, her hand upon his private part and his upon hers. Woo. Caroline, meanwhile, acted like a parody of herself, wearing a startling black wig over a face caked in rouge, sometimes nodding off during the duller parts of the proceedings. But however she conducted herself and however damning the evidence was against her public support for Caroline only increased. Public support for Caroline only increased. So too did libel against the king and his supporters. Realizing there was virtually no chance of getting the bill through both the House of Lords and the House of Commons, the measure was withdrawn. Victory was hollow. Caroline was savvy enough to realize that although she had political supporters, she had virtually no friends. She was Shunned by most of society, and the king's allies made sure that anyone who tried to befriend her saw their reputation shredded in the press. Moreover, the public was fickle and lacked patience for bad behavior. One bit of doggerel popular at the time went, "Most gracious queen, we thee implore to go away and sin no more. Or if that effort be too great, go away at any rate." But she didn't, and her humiliation wasn't over yet. On June 20th, 1821, the date of the king's coronation, Caroline was denied entry at Westminster Abbey. As she had for most of her life, she doggedly refused to concede defeat. Despite having the door literally closed in her face, she wrote to His Majesty that afternoon, "The Queen must trust that after the public insult Her Majesty received the morning, the King will grant her just right to be crowned on next Monday." The King did no such thing. Less than a month later, a sad and deluded Caroline died. Just 53 years old, she had been suffering from an obstruction of her bowels, probably cancer, and had been in near constant pain for most of the summer. In death, Caroline won a final battle, this one for posterity. The British public mourned their queen's passing, and nationwide weeping. Even those aristocrats whose friendship should worn out were inclined to think of this unhappy woman kindly and with pity. Conversely, when George IV died 9 years later, no one shed a tear. The Times declared, "There was never an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king." Well, I hope y'all enjoyed that. That was very interesting right there, okay? Hope y'all enjoyed. Have a great week. Bye.